I knew the HOA was bad news, but I never expected them to try and steal my garage out from under me. It all started with a letter taped to my front door, bold red ink screaming violation notice. I sighed before I even opened it. The HOA in my neighborhood, led by the ever-persistent Cynthia Prescott, had been a thorn in my side since the day I moved in. She had the kind of superiority complex that made her believe she owned every square inch of the community. I unfolded the letter and skimmed through the nonsense. Apparently, my garage was in violation of the community aesthetic standards because I had replaced my old, rotting garage door with a sturdier, modern one without, of course, seeking proper approval from the board. I rolled my eyes. Approval? I owned this property. I paid for that garage door myself. Nothing in the HOA bylaws stated I needed permission for simple repairs, but Cynthia had always been fishing for ways to make my life miserable. 2 days later, I came home to find a second letter this time, demanding that I restore the garage to its original state, or else the HOA would take appropriate action. I decided to confront Cynthia directly. I marched down to the HOA meeting that night, where she sat at the front of the room like a queen perched on her throne. She offered me that fake, tight-lipped smile she always wore when she thought she had the upper hand. "Ah, Walter Davis," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Here to discuss your little garage issue." I crossed my arms. "There is no issue. I replaced a dilapidated garage door with a better one. Nothing in the bylaws says I needed permission." Cynthia clicked her tongue, flipping through a binder with exaggerated care. "Actually, Walter, Section 5, Clause B states that all exterior modifications must be approved by the board." "That clause refers to structural changes," I shot back. "A garage door replacement isn't structural." "Well," she said, feigning sympathy, "the board disagrees, and since you failed to comply, we have decided that your garage is now considered a non-compliant structure. If you don't restore it, we will reclaim it for the community's use." I stared at her, barely able to process the insanity of what she was saying. "You're trying to take my garage," she nodded, entirely too pleased with herself. "As per our authority, we can repurpose community structures that do not align with guidelines." I laughed. "It isn't a community structure, it's mine." Cynthia tilted her head. "Not if the board rules otherwise." That was when I knew she wasn't just power-hungry, she was delusional, but if she thought she could take my property without a fight, she had another thing coming. I walked out of that meeting with one goal in mind, to take this to court. And if Cynthia wanted to play legal games, she was about to regret ever picking this battle. I didn't sleep much the night after that HOA meeting. My mind was too busy running through every possible angle, every legal loophole, every counterstrike I could use against Cynthia and her ridiculous attempt to steal my property. By the time the sun came up, I had a plan. The first thing I did was dig up every document I had on my property. The deed, the plot survey, even the original purchase agreement. I wanted every single piece of evidence that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that my garage was mine and not some community structure Cynthia could claim on a whim. Then, I reached out to my lawyer, Paul Whitaker. Paul and I had gone to college together, and he had built a solid reputation dealing with property disputes, particularly against overreaching HOAs. When I explained the situation, he let out a low whistle and immediately agreed to take the case. Paul wasted no time drafting a cease and desist letter, which we sent directly to Cynthia and the HOA board. The letter made it clear that any attempt to seize my garage would be met with immediate legal action. We also demanded a copy of the HOA's governing documents, including any amendments and meeting minutes related to their supposed authority over private property. 2 days later, I got a response in the form of yet another letter from the HOA. This one was even more outrageous than the last. Cynthia and her board had decided that not only was my garage in violation, but they were now imposing a daily fine until I restored it to compliance. Paul laughed when he read it. "They're bluffing," he said. They don't have the power to impose penalties like this. It's intimidation, nothing more. That was exactly what I suspected. Cynthia was banking on me getting scared and backing down. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Paul and I filed an injunction against the HOA, preventing them from taking any action on my garage until the matter was settled in court. We also submitted a countersuit, arguing that the HOA was engaging in unlawful property interference, fraudulent fines, and attempting to overreach their authority. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Homeowners started whispering about how Cynthia had finally gone too far. A few even reached out to me, sharing their own horror stories about HOA harassment. It turned out I wasn't the only one she had targeted. One neighbor, Janet, told me that Cynthia had forced her to redo her entire driveway because the shade of concrete was too light. Another, Tom, revealed that he had been fined repeatedly for a non-approved mailbox, even though it was the exact same model as Cynthia's. With this new information, I realized something critical: Cynthia wasn't just making up rules to control me. She had been running an entire campaign of abuse against multiple homeowners. I met with Paul again and we adjusted our strategy. Instead of just fighting for my own garage, we were going to take down Cynthia and her entire corrupt operation. The next HOA meeting was packed. Word had spread that I was suing and people wanted to see the fireworks. Cynthia sat at the front, her usual smug confidence slightly shaken. She knew she had pushed too hard, but she was still trying to maintain control. Paul stood up first, holding up a thick folder of legal documents. He outlined the case point by point how the HOA had no authority to seize private property, how their fines were fraudulent, and how Cynthia was abusing her position. The board members exchanged nervous glances. Some of them had clearly been kept in the dark about how far Cynthia had taken things, and they didn't like being dragged into a legal battle. Then, I stood up and dropped the final bombshell. I had spoken to several other homeowners, and we had compiled a formal petition to remove Cynthia from her position. More than half the neighborhood had signed it. Cynthia's face went pale. For the first time, she looked uncertain. She tried to argue, but the board members were already turning against her. Paul and I walked out of that meeting knowing we had already won. The lawsuit was still moving forward, but Cynthia had lost her grip on the community. A week later, the board voted her out. A month after that, we settled in court. The HOA was forced to pay damages, refund every fraudulent fine they had issued, and formally acknowledge that they had no authority over private property. But the best part. During the case, Paul discovered something incredible due to a legal oversight in the HOA's founding documents. A section of land they claimed as common area actually belonged to my property. The court ruling officially transferred that land to me. Cynthia had tried to steal my garage, but in the end, I ended up owning part of the very land the HOA used for their meetings. Poetic justice at its finest. With Cynthia removed and the lawsuit settled, the neighborhood finally had a chance to breathe. The board scrambled to repair their reputation, issuing public apologies and promising reforms. But trust wasn't something they could win back overnight. People had seen how easily power had been abused, and they weren't about to let it happen again. Even though I had won, I wasn't ready to let my guard down. The HOA still existed, and while they had taken a hit, they weren't completely powerless. I needed to ensure they could never pull anything like this again. I started by organizing a group of homeowners who had been affected by Cynthia's reign. Tom, Janet, and several others joined forces with me, eager to make sure the HOA was held accountable. We combed through every bylaw, pinpointing vague language that could be exploited. Paul advised us on which sections could be rewritten to prevent future abuse. One of the biggest changes we pushed for was limiting the board's ability to impose fines without clear, documented violations. No more arbitrary penalties. No more made-up infractions. If they wanted to enforce a rule, they had to prove, with photographic or video evidence, that a real issue existed. We also fought to implement term limits for board members. Cynthia had stayed in power for far too long because no one had bothered to challenge her. That wouldn't happen again. Going forward, no one could serve more than 2 consecutive terms. Revising the bylaws wasn't easy. The remaining board members resisted at first, reluctant to relinquish control. But the neighborhood had changed. People were more engaged, more willing to stand up for themselves. At our next community meeting, we presented the proposed changes, and the homeowners overwhelmingly voted in favor. With these safeguards in place, I finally felt like we had real protection against future overreach. But there was still one last issue to deal with: the land I had won in the court ruling. The small plot that had once been considered common area was now legally mine. It wasn't much, just a section near the community center where the HOA had held meetings and stored maintenance equipment. But owning it gave me leverage, and I intended to use it wisely. The HOA, now desperate to stay in good standing with the community, reached out to negotiate. They wanted to lease the land back from me for a nominal fee. I considered it but ultimately decided against it. Giving them access again would only invite future problems. Instead, I made a different offer. I told them I would sell the land back, but only if the HOA agreed to permanently reduce dues for all homeowners. They balked at first, but they didn't have many options. Without access to that land, they would have to find a new place for their operations, which would cost them far more than what I was asking. After weeks of back and forth discussions, they finally relented. The deal was finalized, and as a result, every homeowner in the neighborhood saw their fees reduced by 20%. The impact was immediate. People were thrilled. For years, they had been paying inflated dues with no real understanding of where the money was going. Now they were finally seeing some relief. With the HOA weakened and the bylaws reformed, the community felt different. People were more engaged, more willing to question authority. The board members who had once ruled unchecked were now under constant scrutiny. They knew they couldn't get away with the same tactics Cynthia had used. As for Cynthia herself, she vanished from the neighborhood soon after she was ousted. Rumor had it she moved to another HOA-controlled community, but I doubted she would ever regain the same level of power she once had. People like her thrived on unchecked authority, and she had learned the hard way that she wouldn't find that here anymore. With everything settled, I finally turned my attention back to my own home. My garage, the very thing that had started this battle, stood exactly as I had intended, untouched by the HOA's interference. It was a quiet victory, but a meaningful one. I had never set out to go to war with the HOA. I just wanted to be left alone to take care of my property without unnecessary interference. But when they came after me, I had no choice but to fight back. In the end, not only had I defended my rights, but I had helped change the neighborhood for the better. As I stood in my driveway, looking at the garage they had tried so hard to take from me, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. They had underestimated me, and they had paid the price for it. The months that followed Cynthia's downfall brought a noticeable shift in the neighborhood. People who had once lived in quiet fear of the HOA now spoke openly about their grievances. The new board, made up of more reasonable and community-focused members, worked hard to repair the damage left behind. But not everyone had learned their lesson. One afternoon, I returned home to find a strange car parked halfway across my driveway. The sedan, an older model with peeling paint, didn't belong to any of my immediate neighbors. At first, I thought it might be a guest of someone nearby, but as I stepped out of my truck, I noticed a woman standing beside it, staring at my garage with obvious displeasure. She was tall, with sharp features and a crisp business suit that looked out of place in the suburban setting. The instant she spotted me, she folded her arms and walked toward me with an air of authority that set off alarm bells. She introduced herself as Miriam Langley, the HOA's new compliance officer. Apparently, despite all the reforms, the board had decided to keep a position dedicated to neighborhood standards. Miriam wasted no time explaining why she was there. She claimed that my garage, despite surviving the legal battle, was still under review. There had been new concerns raised about its alignment with community aesthetics, and she was conducting an inspection. I didn't bother masking my irritation. The HOA had lost its case in court. The bylaws had been rewritten to prevent this kind of nonsense. Whoever had sent Miriam clearly hadn't gotten the message. I asked her what specific concerns had been raised. She hesitated before saying that some residents had complained about disruptive modifications. That was vague enough to be meaningless. I pushed further, demanding to know who had raised these concerns. She refused to name anyone, citing privacy protections. That was when I knew this was just another attempt to exert control. I told her in no uncertain terms that unless she had a legally valid reason and written approval from the board, she had no authority to inspect my property. She didn't like that answer but had no choice but to leave. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. A week later, I received another letter from the HOA. This time, they were claiming that my garage's exterior finish had been altered in a way that violated the historical integrity of the neighborhood. The absurdity of it made me laugh. Historical integrity. This neighborhood wasn't a century-old landmark. It was a collection of mid-range homes built in the early 90s. It was clear that some lingering force within the HOA still wanted to make my life difficult. My guess was that Cynthia's influence hadn't completely faded. Rather than let them drag me into another drawn-out battle, I decided to get ahead of the situation. I dug through the revised bylaws, looking for any loophole they might be exploiting. That was when I found something interesting. The new rules required any compliance officer's findings to be supported by a majority vote from the board before any action could be taken. That meant Miriam had overstepped her authority when she conducted her so-called inspection. If she had acted without board approval, then her claims were invalid. I compiled all the evidence and sent a formal complaint to the board, outlining how Miriam had violated procedure. I also requested access to the meeting minutes where my garage had supposedly been discussed. Days passed without a response. Then, out of nowhere, I received an email from one of the newer board members, a man named Daniel Reese. He had been one of the few reasonable voices during the bylaw reform process, and he wasn't happy about what was happening. Daniel revealed that there had been no official meeting regarding my garage. No vote had been taken. Miriam had acted entirely on her own or at the direction of someone behind the scenes. That was all I needed to hear. At the next HOA meeting, I arrived early, armed with everything I had gathered. Miriam was there, sitting stiffly at the side of the room, avoiding my gaze. When the meeting started, I stood up and presented my case to the board. I laid out how Miriam had conducted an unauthorized inspection, how no formal vote had been taken, and how the complaint against my garage was completely baseless. Then, I turned to Daniel and asked him to confirm that no meeting had ever occurred on the matter. Daniel, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to lie, admitted the truth. The board had never approved an investigation into my property. A murmur of confusion spread through the room. Homeowners were starting to realize that someone was still trying to manipulate the system. That was when I decided to take things a step further. I directly asked Miriam who had instructed her to target my garage. She hesitated for too long. Then, under pressure, she finally admitted that she had been given guidance from an outside consultant. I pressed harder. Who was this consultant? She didn't want to answer, but the weight of the room forced her to speak. Cynthia. Gasps spread across the crowd. Cynthia had been working behind the scenes, using Miriam as her puppet to continue her vendetta against me. The board members shifted uncomfortably, realizing how bad this looked. Daniel, seeing an opportunity to fix the mess, immediately called for a vote to terminate Miriam's position. The motion passed overwhelmingly. Miriam stormed out, but the damage was done. The HOA had been caught again violating its own rules. With Miriam gone and Cynthia's influence finally severed, the board had no choice but to issue a formal apology. They rescinded all complaints against my garage and assured the community that external interference would no longer be tolerated. This time I believed them. As I walked out of the meeting, I could feel the shift in the air. The HOA had exhausted its credibility. The people weren't afraid of them anymore. It was over. For good. With Miriam gone and Cynthia's influence severed, the HOA was in full damage control mode. The board wanted to project stability, but the cracks in their authority were too deep to ignore. Homeowners had lost faith, and for the first time in years, people weren't just accepting the board's decisions without question. I could have stopped there. I had won every battle they threw at me, reclaimed my property, and forced them to lower dues for everyone. But something still nagged at me. The HOA had been exposed, but the system itself remained intact. As long as it existed in its current form, the risk of future corruption remained. I wasn't about to let that happen. I began researching ways to strip the HOA of its power permanently. Many homeowners thought HOAs were untouchable, but that wasn't true. In some states, if enough homeowners voted in favor, an HOA could be dissolved entirely. The process was complicated, requiring legal filings, majority votes, and often a drawn-out legal battle, but it wasn't impossible. I quietly reached out to Paul, my attorney, and asked him to dig into the specifics of our community's governing documents. If there was a legal path to dismantling the HOA, I wanted to know about it. While Paul worked on that, I turned my attention to the remaining board members. The board had been shaken by recent events, but some of them still clung to their positions, hoping to salvage what was left. They had kept their heads down while Cynthia ruled, and now they were trying to reshape the narrative, pretending they had been victims of her influence rather than willing enablers. I wasn't going to let them rewrite history. At the next board meeting, I arrived early and took a seat near the front. The room was fuller than usual. Homeowners who had previously ignored these meetings were now showing up in force. The energy was different. People weren't just there to listen anymore. They were ready to act. When the meeting began, I raised my hand immediately, forcing the board to acknowledge me. They hesitated before allowing me to speak, clearly wary of what I was about to say. Instead of another legal challenge, I went straight for something they couldn't ignore: transparency. I requested a full financial audit of the HOA's expenditures over the last 5 years. If the board truly wanted to regain the community's trust, they needed to prove that HOA funds had been used appropriately. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't expected this. One of them, a man named Howard, tried to deflect by saying that financial records were already available upon request. I countered by asking why, if the records were so accessible, no one in the community had ever been given a detailed breakdown of where their dues were going. The room fell silent. People were waiting for an answer, and none of the board members seemed eager to provide one. Sensing their hesitation, I pressed further. I motioned to Daniel, the only board member who had shown any integrity throughout this ordeal. He had already proven that he wasn't entirely on their side. Daniel hesitated, then admitted that while records existed, they weren't exactly easy to access. Homeowners had to submit formal requests, and even then, the documents provided were vague, often missing key details. That was the moment the floodgates opened. Other homeowners started speaking up, demanding to know why their dues had been raised multiple times over the years with no clear explanation. Some asked why certain community projects had been delayed indefinitely despite money being allocated for them. The board was completely overwhelmed. They had spent years operating without scrutiny, and now they were being forced to answer for every unexplained expense, every questionable fee, every decision made behind closed doors. Seeing an opportunity, I made my final move. I proposed a community-wide vote to determine whether the HOA should continue to exist in its current form. If enough homeowners supported the idea, we could begin legal proceedings to dissolve it entirely. The reaction was immediate. Some people were hesitant, worried about what the absence of an HOA would mean for property values and maintenance. But others were fully on board, tired of the constant fines, the arbitrary rules, and the abuse of power. The board had no choice but to allow the vote. If they refused, it would only confirm what everyone already suspected, that they were more interested in controlling the community than serving it. Paul helped me draft the petition, ensuring it met all legal requirements. Over the next few weeks, I went door to door explaining to homeowners what was at stake. Some were skeptical, but many were eager for change. Slowly but surely, the signatures piled up. As the deadline for the vote approached, the board grew desperate. They sent out letters warning of the chaos that would follow if the HOA was dissolved. They tried to scare people into thinking property values would plummet, that the neighborhood would fall into disrepair, that without them, everything would collapse. I wasn't surprised by their tactics, but what did surprise me was how ineffective they were. People had seen too much. They had watched the HOA abuse its power firsthand. They had witnessed Cynthia's downfall, Miriam's removal, and the exposure of financial mismanagement. Their fear was gone. When the final vote was counted, the results were undeniable. Over 60% of homeowners supported the dissolution of the HOA. It was more than enough to move forward with legal proceedings. The board fought back, hiring their own attorneys to challenge the vote, but the law was on our side. After months of legal wrangling, the decision was finalized. The HOA was officially disbanded. For the first time in decades, the neighborhood was free. The transition wasn't immediate. There were logistical hurdles to overcome, responsibilities to redistribute, and new systems to put in place. But the difference was undeniable. Homeowners worked together, forming voluntary committees to handle shared concerns without the overreach of authoritarian rule. Without the constant threat of fines and arbitrary enforcement, people actually took better care of their properties. The neighborhood didn't fall into chaos, it flourished. As for me, I watched it all unfold from the same driveway that had started this entire battle. My garage still stood, untouched, a symbol of everything I had fought for. The HOA had tried to take it from me. They had tried to control my property, my rights, and my choices. In the end, I had taken everything from them instead. With the HOA officially dissolved, the neighborhood entered a new era. The absence of their constant oversight felt strange at first, like getting used to the absence of a long-standing nuisance. Some homeowners initially worried about how things would function without a governing body. But those fears quickly faded as people took ownership of their community in ways they never had before. Without the arbitrary fines and power struggles, residents started working together rather than against each other. A group of volunteers organized a maintenance schedule for shared spaces, ensuring public areas remained in good condition. Homeowners who had once resented the HOA's interference now took pride in maintaining their properties, proving that people didn't need threats of penalties to keep a neighborhood looking nice. Even though the fight was over, I wasn't ready to step back completely. After everything the HOA had pulled, I wanted to make sure no similar organization could rise from its ashes. That meant ensuring we had legal protections in place to prevent another power-hungry board from taking control. Paul helped draft a neighborhood charter, a simple agreement among homeowners that outlined basic property rights and expectations, without handing unchecked power to a centralized group. The document prevented any single person or committee from imposing fines or making arbitrary decisions about private property. It cemented what we had fought so hard to achieve, a community free from unnecessary control. The charter was met with overwhelming support. People had seen firsthand what unchecked authority could do, and no one wanted to repeat that nightmare. Once it was signed, it became the guiding document for how the neighborhood would function moving forward, ensuring that no HOA could ever rise again. One of the most satisfying moments came when the former HOA office was finally cleared out. The building, which had once housed their records and hosted their meetings, had lost all purpose. It stood as a relic of their failed rule. Since the land technically belonged to the neighborhood now, we held a vote on what to do with it. The decision was nearly unanimous. It would be turned into a community space. Within weeks, volunteers began repurposing the building. Walls were repainted, unnecessary furniture was cleared out, and the space was transformed into a gathering hub for the neighborhood. Instead of being a place where people were lectured about rules and fines, it became a space for events, meetings, and even weekend markets where residents could sell homemade goods. It was a fitting end to the HOA's reign. The very building they had used to enforce their power had been reclaimed for something positive. Cynthia, meanwhile, had completely vanished from public conversation. After it became clear that she had no path back to her former influence, she put her house up for sale and disappeared. No one missed her. Miriam, the so-called compliance officer, had also moved on. Rumor had it she had tried to find work in another HOA-controlled neighborhood, but her reputation had followed her. No one wanted to hire someone whose last job had ended in a legal disaster. With the biggest threats gone, life in the neighborhood settled into a peaceful rhythm. People who had once been strangers now greeted each other in passing, no longer divided by fear of false violations or ridiculous fees. The hostility that had been a constant presence under the HOA's rule had dissolved, replaced by a sense of genuine community. For the first time in years, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. I had never wanted to go to war with the HOA, but when they tried to take what was mine, they left me no choice. In the end, their greed and arrogance had been their undoing. I had fought back and I had won, not just for myself but for everyone in the neighborhood. And best of all, my garage, the very thing they had tried to take, stood exactly as it always had, untouched and completely mine.